delivering instruction to best reach each and every student in every classroom. Differentiation is one of the 5 dimensions in the instruction domain, dimension 2.4. The overall definition reminds us that the teacher differentiates instruction, aligning methods and techniques to diverse student needs. In order to provide differentiated instruction, each teacher must have knowledge about the individual learning characteristics, strengths, and needs of all students in that classroom. Let's look now at research about differentiation. Researchers at the National Center on Accessing the General Curriculum define differentiated instruction as a process to approach teaching and learning for students of differing abilities in the same class. The intent is to maximize each student's growth and individual success by meeting each student where he or she is, rather than expecting students to modify themselves for the curriculum. Also, according to Tomlinson and Strickland, teachers usually differentiate instruction by adjusting one or more of the following: the content, meaning what students learn; the process, how students learn; or the product, how students demonstrate their mastery of knowledge or skills. However, there is no one-size-fits-all model for differentiating instruction. It looks different depending on the prior knowledge, interests, and abilities students bring to a learning situation. Across the literature, experts suggest these guiding principles to support differentiated classroom practices. First, focus on the essential ideas and skills of the content area, eliminating ancillary tasks and activities. Next, respond to individual student differences, such as learning style, prior knowledge, interests, and level of engagement. Also, group students flexibly by sharing interest, topic, or ability. Next, integrate ongoing and meaningful assessments with instruction. And last, continually assess, reflect, and adjust content, process, and product to meet students' needs. One of the leading educators and researchers for differentiated instruction, Carol Ann Tomlinson, examined school-level and district-level implementation of differentiated instruction and identified ways that education leaders can best support this change in practice. First, she recommends that leaders first develop a solid understanding of differentiated instruction so that they can present it coherently to teachers and provide committed school-level leadership. Also, leaders should also nurture different teaching models, encourage teachers to apply differentiation with flexibility, creativity, and choice, and provide teachers with high-quality professional development as well as time to collaborate, plan, and implement differentiation. Given these 2 recommendations, what is happening in your campus, and how might teachers be further supported in implementing differentiation? Let's now look at the connections to the Texas Teacher Standards as noted in Texas Administrative Code, Chapter 149.1001. Differentiation connects specifically to Standard 1, Instructional Planning and Delivery, and Standard 2, Knowledge of Students. In looking at the specific indicators for the Texas Teacher Standards, the first one tells us that teachers design lessons to meet the needs of diverse learners, adapting methods when appropriate. Another indicator tells us that teachers differentiate instruction, aligning methods and techniques to diverse student learning needs, including acceleration, remediation, and implementation of individual education plans. Also, teachers plan student groupings, including pairings and individualized and small group instruction to facilitate student learning. Teachers integrate the use of oral, written, graphic, kinesthetic, and/or tactile methods to teach key concepts. The standards also tell us that teachers create a community of learners in an inclusive environment that views differences in learning and background as educational assets. And last, as one of the other key connections to the standards, teachers accept responsibility for their growth of all their students, persisting in their efforts to ensure high levels of growth on the part of each learner. This dimension addresses how instruction is tailored or differentiated to meet the individual learning needs of all students. Teachers can differentiate the content that is taught by segmenting the learning objectives, how the students are expected to process information through varied instructional strategies, the types of products or outcomes the students are expected to produce, or the learning environment through grouping strategies, student work areas, tapping students' learning styles, or other participation approaches. As we transition to the next slide, these are further defined. Differentiation may include adjustments in content, process, products, or the learning environment. Differentiation of content offers students the opportunity to begin at different places in the curriculum and or proceed at different paces. Differentiation of process refers to how activities are varied to meet student interests or preferences for learning. Product differentiation means that students have some choice in how they will demonstrate what they have learned. The use of product choices is a common way for students to meet the required learning objectives while tapping the students' areas of strengths and increase motivation. The tone of any classroom greatly affects those who inhabit it and the learning that takes place there. Classroom environment in a setting that strives for differentiation is, if anything, even more of a factor in shaping success. A differentiated classroom should support and is supported by an evolving community of learners. What this means is that the teacher leads students in developing the sorts of attitudes, beliefs, and practices that are conducive to learning. Let's look at the continuum of descriptors in this dimension to clarify the overall intent for proficient, accomplished, and distinguished performance levels. The subsequent slides will provide further explanations about actual classroom practices. One misconception, though, is that the differentiation dimension simply means that teachers are working with small groups of students. The dimension and evidence collected during classroom instruction extend far beyond that basic practice. For the first continuum of descriptors, lessons are flexible and dynamic. They are adjusted based on individual student needs and targeted groups of students. The strategy should focus on addressing student-specific strengths and needs, creating student-centered learning. With the second continuum, teachers use varied methods to consistently monitor the quality of student participation and performance in classroom instruction, and with extended learning assignments such as homework, projects, and others. Students are provided with clear expectations for participation and performance, along with focused feedback to ensure that they understand whether levels of participation and performance are on target. The third continuum of descriptors addresses differentiation from both instructional methods and content perspectives to ensure that students master what is being taught. Teachers understand how differentiated content, activities, and materials are used to scaffold teaching and learning, provide acceleration, remediation, and address the requirements of the individual education plans for students who are participating in special programs. The last set of descriptors focuses on how teachers recognize cues to indicate that students are confused or disengaged with the lesson. Teachers have an extensive repertoire of teaching strategies and are well informed about when to specifically use these strategies to get students reconnected with the lesson and learning. Consistent and ongoing checks for understanding, feedback, and lesson adjustments are implemented to reinforce learning and increase motivation with students during the lesson. Because numerous inquiries and questions during training and in the field are tied to this dimension, we want to further explain the descriptors. Descriptor 1 reads, adapts lessons to address individual needs of all students. When we go back and look at what this descriptor might mean, effective teachers have a strong understanding of how instructional strategies should be varied and an extensive repertoire of teaching strategies to adjust these based on individual student needs and targeted groups of students. They also know how to design lessons which begin with the content standards, meaning what students are expected to know and be able to do, and purposefully link the instructional strategies, how students process the content, to understand what is being taught in order to best support students' mastery of the learning objectives. In looking at descriptor 2, it reads, regularly monitors the quality of student participation and performance. For descriptor 2, some actual behaviors we might see include teachers implement various methods to consistently monitor the quality of student participation and performance in classroom instruction and with extended learning assignments, for example, homework, projects, etc. Students are provided with clear explanations for participation and performance, along with focused feedback to ensure that they understand whether levels of participation and performance are on target with the expectations. Descriptor 3 reads, provides differentiated instructional methods and content to ensure students have the opportunity to master what is being taught. For descriptor 3, we might see that teachers know their students and their individual learning strengths and needs and use this information as a basis for planning instruction based on student readiness, interest, and learning styles. Teachers also consistently use data and assessments to determine each student's current level of performance in relation to specific learning standards and objectives as a way to design instruction which best increases the likelihood that students will master both the prerequisite knowledge and skills as well as the actual learning objectives. And last, descriptor 4 reads, recognizes when students become confused or disengaged and responds to student learning or social emotional needs. For this descriptor, some of the behaviors we might see are that teachers recognize signals that indicate that students are confused or disengaged with the lesson, for example, bored, frustrated, feeling inadequate, not participating, etc. Teachers have an extensive repertoire of teaching strategies and are well informed about when to specifically use these strategies to teach the learning standards. Teachers also adjust content delivery in response to student progress and participation through the use of developmentally appropriate strategies which maximize student engagement, including looking closely at the specific aspects of the learning environment. In looking at one lens about what might happen before, during, and after the lesson, let's see what the impact is in relation to the differentiation dimension. Before the lesson, how does the teacher use multiple sources of data and assessments to plan for differentiated classroom instruction that addresses the unique learning needs of all students? In other words, how is data used to inform the construct of the lesson so that it truly is differentiated to meet the unique learning needs of all these students? During the actual lesson, how does the teacher monitor participation and performance to determine whether students are learning what was expected during classroom instruction and address confusion or perhaps disengagement when those behaviors are present? After the lesson, how does the teacher reflect on the impact with differentiation, including whether the methods and techniques used during the lesson were successful? As part of the continuous improvement cycle, We want teachers to begin thinking about what happens before the lesson, during the lesson, and after the lesson in order to refine practice. Continuing to take this to the practical level, let's look at t-tests in practice. What happens with differentiation? Teachers design lessons to meet the needs of diverse learners, adapting methods when appropriate. Teachers differentiate instruction, aligning methods and techniques to diverse student needs, including acceleration, remediation, and implementation of individual education plans. Teachers design instruction, change strategies, and differentiate their teaching practices to improve student learning based on assessment outcomes. And teachers combine results from different measures to develop a holistic picture of students' strengths and learning needs in order to plan for differentiated instruction. Additional practices we might see include teachers plan student groupings, including pairings and individualized and small group instruction to facilitate student learning. Teachers integrate the use of oral, written, graphic, kinesthetic, and/or tactile methods to teach key concepts. Teachers create a physical classroom setup that is flexible and accommodates the different learning needs of students. Teachers design effective assessments as a fundamental part of teaching and learning to formally and informally assess students' progress and learning needs. These are just some of the practices that you might see as evidence for the differentiation dimension of the t-test rubric. When we look at the continuum of learners in our schools, whether we're talking about students who struggle or those that perhaps need to be challenged, how do we differentiate learning? Two key terms to consider are voice and choice. What do voice and choice mean to you and your teachers? What does student voice and choice in the classroom mean? And how do these terms relate to differentiated practice? Less teacher-centered instruction and more student-centered learning shifts the learning environment. In what ways do you include student voice and student choice in your curriculum? A challenge is talk about voice and choice with your teachers. What do these terms mean to them? And in what ways do those terms relate to differentiation in your school? Think about all the key points that have been presented in this module and look at this slide that has questions to help guide you, the appraiser. Take a minute to read through these questions. These are just some of the questions tied to the t-test rubric for the differentiation dimension. Some of these questions may be used during the pre-conference to help the teacher think about differentiation prior to the lesson, or during an actual post-conference to help the teacher be reflective about practices related to differentiation. In either instance, questions are used then to help the teacher be reflective about practices and make decisions about how to refine practices over time. In keeping with the topic of questions, here are pre- and post-conference sample questions. Take a minute to read through these. Notice how the questions are open-ended and invite thinking and reflection. Beyond pre- and post-conferences, what forums are available for teachers to be reflective about their practices and how they're planning lessons and executing lessons which meet the needs of all students in their classrooms? As we wind down this module, let's talk about what effective teachers do. Effective teachers have a strong understanding of how instructional strategies should be varied and an extensive repertoire of teaching methods. They adjust these based on individual student needs and targeted groups of students. They also know how to design standards-based lessons and purposefully link the instructional strategies to best support students' mastery of the learning objectives based on individual student needs. Effective teachers monitor performance and assess how students are responding to varied intervention strategies, including those identified through the RTI process. All levels of performance are addressed through rigorous and challenging instruction that best meets the needs of the individual and collective learner. Effective teachers recognize signals that indicate that students are confused or disengaged with the lesson. They have an extensive repertoire of teaching strategies, and they are well informed about when to specifically use these strategies to authentically connect students. They also integrate the use of oral, written, graphic, kinesthetic, and/or tactile methods to teach key concepts. Teachers create a physical classroom setup that is flexible and accommodates the different learning needs of students. And last, teachers design effective assessments as a fundamental part of teaching and learning to formally and informally assess students' progress and learning needs. What else do effective teachers do related to differentiation? Now, as a final review, how do we ensure that instruction differs from student to student? Take a minute to review this acrostic to recap what you've learned. As discussed earlier, this dimension often creates lots of questions about what look-fors include in classroom instruction. Therefore, given what was presented in this module, what are your next steps to grow and develop in this area? And how will you support teachers in growing and developing in this area? We want to thank you for participating, and we look forward to you joining us with the next module.